So I don't know how many of you know about the Dorchester. Do any of you know about that ship? Amy, anyone else? So the Dorchester was a very famous ship that had an unfortunate end, and it was the third largest loss of life incident on the seas during World War II. And on it, something very profound, something striking, and something which ultimately changed for the better the American landscape, especially the relationship between Jews and Christians. So what could have happened on a ship that was sunk by a submarine during World War II to have done this, you may ask? Well, you can imagine what happens when any ship is torpedoed. Sailors go a little bit scared. They're all looking for life vests, and there were 4 chaplains, Rabbi Alexander Good, Catholic priest John Washington, Dutch Reformed minister Clark Poling, and Methodist minister George Fox, who assisted sailors in finding life vests all over the ship. And when there were no more life vests to be found, took theirs off, gave them to sailors, and the 4 of them stood on the bow of the ship praying together, and was last seen by sailors as the ship sunk into the sea. That image of Jews and of Christians of many different types praying together had a profound impact in America. As you can imagine, it went on in 1948 to form a postage stamp, and at a memorial service for the victims of the Dorchester, President Truman said, "I don't think in the history of the world that there has been anything in heroism equal to this. It was the greatest sermon ever preached." Only 200 individuals survived, and the last sailor died in 2013. And it's incumbent upon us, I think, to start to remember incidents like the Dorchester. Why? Because if we understand anything about our history, we can recognize quite easily that incidents like that, where people come together, are of profound importance. We really understand the history of Judeo-Christian relationships by that example. You may believe that it begun actually when the nation was founded. After all, we just read verses, biblical and non-biblical, indicating that we were a Judeo-Christian nation. In fact, that is not the case. We were a Christian nation in this country. How can I say this with such profound clarity? Well, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were deists. And the big thing at the time was that for them, they believed wholeheartedly that religion was the root cause of tyranny and bloodshed. And they were speaking up against other American revolutionaries. Of course, the deists won out and maintained a sense of power in Washington, D.C., and therefore were able to craft laws dictating freedom of religion. Furthermore, during the Revolutionary War, there was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment, shocking as that may seem today. Oh, wait a second, we still had a strong anti-Catholic sentiment when President Kennedy was running. But that being said, many revolutionaries who were supporting the United States and engaging in a revolution against England really were deeply Christian. If we even can think of President Andrew Jackson, somebody who said not to have a strong education, he was deeply educated in the church and knew his Bible intimately, verbatim, you could argue. All of this to say that for the entire decade or the entire century of the 1800s, we can look at all of our politicians and leaders from those eras of having a strong Christian background, which we saw finally erode in the 1930s. Now, what was going on in the world in the 1930s? Anybody? 1930s, 1920s was depression, 1930s was Hitler, thank you. So interfaith dialogue began in earnest in the 1930s. Paul Tillich, one of the foremost Christian theologians of that time, said, "The Protestant church in Germany has fallen under the spell of Hitlerism. The Jewish Christian tradition must fight Hitler." And we can start to see rabbis such as Abba Hillel Silver, and after him Leo back in England, and others really coming out and speaking out and attempting to engage with their Christian friends, their Christian ministers, to form a strong, positive Jewish-Christian relationship. That's where the Jewish-Christian alliances started to come into play. And we really got to see, most famously, culminating with Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King and also engaged in dialogue regularly at Union Theological Seminary, one of the strong houses of Christian thought in the 1960s and 70s, especially with Reverend Niemöller, who was there and actively engaging in a positive sense with him as well. In the 1980s, though, we see a turn in that relationship. The Jewish tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, became much more associated with the right wing, for good or for bad. And it's been challenged ever since. In some cases, we see that the Judeo-Christian stance has become even more fundamentalist when we want to embrace it as something that we want to believe and understand, as Dr. Martin Luther King spoke in his I Had a Dream speech, and we just read a few minutes ago, that the tradition is intended to be present for all, so that everybody has a voice, Jews and African Americans alike. But it was in 1773 that Rabbi Carrigal, who was the rabbi of the Newport Island Synagogue, famously warned future Americans that imaginary conceptions and remote applications of the Hebrew Bible were no basis on which to justify American politics. Almost eerily, that he understood that if we simply looked at things and wanted to read something into the Bible, that was not going to justify a strong foundation for this country. Instead, what we needed to do was form this country based on equality, based on the understanding as described by Thomas Jefferson, though we have to expand Thomas Jefferson's understanding of man as humans and of all races, of course, today. As we celebrate 245 years as a nation this weekend, we find ourselves even more separated by individuals who are self-identified as blue and self-identifying as red, and sometimes something in between, and if you're lucky, maybe even a little purple smattered in there. Why not? It is not unique that we have debated who we are. We have fought civil wars in this country. We have debated if deists versus Christians were going to win out an understanding of religion. We have debated and been challenged by industrialists and robber barons. And now we are even more challenged as we find ourselves pigeonholed further in one camp or another. It is, I think, we must remember the words at this time of President Truman and the image on the Dorchester. The image of 4 men holding each other's hands, praying together. That in his words, that was the greatest sermon ever preached. We must lean in, we must think back, and we must learn our lessons from the past. May you be inspired this 4th of July to find somebody that you don't ordinarily talk to, reach out, share a hot dog or something fun, and have a wonderful 4th of July.